Of course, these Wahhabis don't always advertise their belief in the legitimacy of mass takfir and mass killing. This is because Wahhabism holds that you can temporarily suspend the obligation of killing non-Wahhabis based on the excuse for ignorance, or al-udhr bil-jahl. So even though non-Wahhabis have beliefs which make them kafirs who should be killed, these Wahhabis may be ignorant about why their beliefs are wrong. As long as they're ignorant, then they're not to be killed. Rather, you educate them about why they're wrong, and once the non-Wahhabis have been presented with enough proof, if they still refuse to change their beliefs, then they should be killed. In other words, Wahhabis insist that they have an obligation to kill Ash'aris, Maturidis, Sufis, followers of the four legal schools, and the Shia. But Wahhabis can suspend the killing until the time when these groups have been presented with sufficient proofs of their error. Now we come to a key point. Wahhabis admit that there are no clear standards for determining when a non-Wahhabi has been presented with sufficient proof of his error. At what point does the non-Wahhabi no longer have the excuse for ignorance? This is a question with no clear-cut answer. Rather, it's a highly subjective matter of ijtihad. So on one extreme, Ibn Abdul Wahhab believed that anyone who had simply heard the Quran had already been presented with sufficient proof such that they no longer have the excuse of ignorance. At the other end of the spectrum, there are other Wahhabis who argue that an individual may require decades of education before the excuse of ignorance no longer applies. But the point is, Wahhabis who hold that non-Wahhabis should receive a long education before they're killed insist that this is their personal ijtihad. However, at the same time, they accept as legitimate the ijtihad of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and ISIS that non-Wahhabis should be killed without a long education. According to them, it's all legitimate ikhtilaf. Many Wahhabi YouTubers will claim that they don't agree with ISIS massacres. But it's not that they don't agree with ISIS massacres because they think ISIS is a deviant group with deviant usul. In reality, they disagree with ISIS just as a matter of practical ijtihad. It's an ikhtilafi issue for them, like the ikhtilaf between Hanafis and Shafis on whether eating shrimp is halal. This is also why Wahhabi YouTubers will never call out Ibn Abdul Wahhab and ISIS as deviants for killing Sufis and Shia. They might not personally accept the mass killings of Sufis and Shia done by Ibn Abdul Wahhab and ISIS, but they don't think that the mass killing of Sufis and Shia is due to deviance. They just chalk it up to a difference of opinion, ikhtilaf. Of course, there are some Wahhabis, in particular the Madkhalis, who make a big deal about having a problem with ISIS and consider them a deviant group, but their issue with ISIS is not that ISIS is mass takfiring and mass killing Sufis and Shia. Their problem with ISIS is that ISIS does not have the backing of the Wali al-Amr, meaning they're not backed by a state government. That's literally their only issue. If ISIS were being openly backed by the Saudi government, then Madkhalis would have no problem with them. When Madkhalis denounce ISIS as takfiri, they don't have a problem with ISIS mass takfiring Muslims. They have a problem with ISIS takfiring the Gulf rulers. That's literally their only problem. This is how all the different strands of Wahhabism, whether ISIS or Madkhali or Haddadi, all of them are united in their hatred and mass takfir of the ummah. You can even do this to test yourself. Next time you come across a Wahhabi, ask him if he condemns the bombing of a Sufi, Ash'ari, or a Shia mosque. If the Wahhabi is an ISIS type, he'll say, "Of course I don't condemn the bombing of a Sufi, Ash'ari, or Shia mosque. That's legitimate jihad." If the Wahhabi is a Madkhali type, you have to modify your question slightly. You have to ask if the Gulf rulers ordered the bombing of a Sufi, Ash'ari, or Shia mosque. Would you then condemn it? The Madkhali would say, "Of course I don't condemn it. That's the legitimate actions of the ruler." If the Wahhabi is a Haddadi type, and you ask him to condemn the bombing of a Sufi, Ash'ari, or Shia mosque, he might do taqiyya at first and say something generic like, "Oh, I don't agree with indiscriminate violence." But this is just playing word games. Sure, you don't believe in indiscriminate violence, but you do believe in discriminate violence, namely violence that discriminately targets Sufis, Ash'aris, and Shia, and non-Wahhabis more generally. Ask him specifically, do you condemn the mass takfir and slaughter of Sufis, Ash'aris, Shia, and non-Wahhabis? And do you consider this to be deviant? At this point, the Haddadi is stuck, because if he does condemn all this as deviance, he'll also have to condemn his Sheikh Ibn Abdul Wahhab as a deviant, and he won't do that. At most, he can say that he just doesn't agree with the ijtihad of those Wahhabis who do slaughter Sufis, Ash'aris, and Shia and bomb their mosques. But it's just an ikhtilafi issue, not a matter of deviance or deviant aqidah. This is how you smoke out the Wahhabis and expose them for their violent hatred towards 95% of the Ummah. The other important point about the subjectivity of the excuse for ignorance is that Wahhabis use this as a blackmail tactic. Again, the key characteristic of the principle for excusing for ignorance is that it's highly subjective. Since the Wahhabis have justifications for why 95% of the Ummah have kufr beliefs, they can always claim that any particular Muslim is upon kufr and has already received sufficient education and hence should be considered a kafir and fought through jihad. Alternatively, the Wahhabi can always claim that this particular Muslim has not received sufficient education and hence he's ignorant and should not be declared a kafir and he should not be fought, at least not yet. This is extremely important for understanding Wahhabis. Wahhabis have already collected evidence. They've collected a file which to their minds proves that every single non-Wahhabi endorses kufr in some form or fashion. The only question is whether to declare them kafirs now and fight them now, or give them some more time to a later date. What guides Wahhabis in these decisions is nothing but political interests rather than principles. Whenever a non-Wahhabi opposes Wahhabi rule and political interests, Wahhabis declare him to be a kafir who's received sufficient instruction. But whenever a non-Wahhabi doesn't oppose the Wahhabis, they just excuse him as being ignorant and they leave him alone. It's actually really sick how these Wahhabis operate. It's like they have this loaded gun pointed at everyone. Whenever Wahhabis encounter a political rival or a potential ideological opponent who will not submit to them, they do detailed research into this person's beliefs. If this person's beliefs aren't public, the Wahhabis will demand that he make public his beliefs. And if the person refuses to do this, the Wahhabis say he's hiding his aqidah, and hiding your aqidah makes you a deviant. They then continuously harass this opponent with aqidah test after aqidah test, demanding that he answer questions in order to gather more material and build up a file of alleged kufr beliefs. Then they use that file to attack the opponent. They start by calling him a deviant, but if he refuses to bend the knee, they escalate to saying that he's upon kufr or he is a shirk apologist. And if he still refuses to submit to these Wahhabis, they then declare him a kafir. At that point, they know that declaring him a kafir means that he's an apostate, which means his blood is halal. And of course, this is precisely what the Wahhabis have been doing to me. This is how Wahhabis operate. And in the context of social media, these are the tactics Wahhabis use to make sure no social media figure, sheikh, imam, or da'i openly opposes them or calls out the deviance of Wahhabism.